All right. Hey, welcome everybody. I am so glad that you're here for this session. And it's kind of interesting to be at the end of the second day of MIX. There's been so much talk about services and a lot of incredible things. I was just thinking, I was sitting in the OData session just right before this one, and I was thinking about how far we've come in a couple of years. Just a couple of years ago, I didn't know the first thing about REST. I remember it's literally about this time, March 2008, that I took on this job, and my predecessor, who was a guy that moved on to work on Azure, he said, you really got to focus on REST, and you're going to have to understand, things like conditional get and content negotiation. And he lists off a whole bunch of things, and I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I mean, that was just like, I had to go figure it out. And at the time, there was very little information about how to do it. It was, really hard. You occasionally would run across somebody's blog with some little tidbit and, kind of figure it out. And then last year I came here to MIX and I gave a talk on how do you do REST with WCF. And it was great. It was fantastic. And then now, but still there was this feeling like, are we still in the war? There was this kind of war like, SOAP people and Rastafarians, and the SOAP people and the Rastafarians. And so there's like this war going on. And now I feel like nobody's saying that anymore. Like the war is over. Okay, it's not even an issue anymore. And you can, if you say who won, look at what all of the emphasis is on here this year, right? Okay, I'm not saying that SOAP is gone and never, it's still around, still useful in scenarios and things like that. But I'm just saying, look how far we've come. It's very interesting. And the data service stuff and OData is just flipping cool. I mean, it's darn cool. I'm not an expert on OData, by the way. I don't pretend to be one. In fact, I should take this off so I don't mess up the microphone. But I'm going to show you yet again. For anybody who happened to be dozing all day and missed it, I'm going to show you just some little tidbits of OData. Now, I was asking around here, or you probably all heard me talking about, what are we going to talk about today? And this is a very interesting titled session, this driving experiences with the .NET Framework. And I was thinking about experiences. And we sort of transitioned with the web in the last few years. I don't know if you noticed it. I noticed it because I have kids who've grown into teenagers. I have 19, 16, and 12 at home, and I kind of watch them as they progress. These are the kids that grew up with the web, and they think of it differently than I did. And really, they think about experiences with the web. And so, their assumption is that wherever I am, I should be able to kind of share, explore, and question my world. And, of course, we started that way, right? Us old-timers, in 1995, we were there with our Windows 95 doing the web, and, we were exploring our world. But it was largely like if I was out here with you, I would have to think about, okay, when I get back to my office and I get on my PC, then I'm going to look up this thing, right? And so we kind of started at that point. But then what's happened in the recent history is we sort of added this dimension of with others. Right, and so now, I got all these people on Facebook who want to be your friends, right? And I just kind of give up. I'm like, okay, whoever you are, I guess you're my friend, okay, So and so I got all these feeds with lots of people, and I see what they had for breakfast, and what they're doing tomorrow, and things like that. It's cool, It is the with others dimension of the experience, and that we expect that there's an experience that we have we share with others. And then really the third part of this is kind of what's really changed in the recent past is when and how I want. Like even right now, I can flip open my phone here, I can text out on Twitter, I'm speaking at MIX10 right now, bing, and everybody who follows me is going to get that, and I mean, right now, on whatever device I have at hand. Now, primarily today, when we think of a device I have at hand, we're thinking about a phone. But I'm just thinking in the future, how's this going to play out? Right? I think in the future, almost anything we interact with is going to be a compute device capable of doing interesting things for us. You know, it's already getting that way. I mean, your car has a computer in it. It's not very useful for this kind of stuff yet, but you can imagine when wireless internet is kind of ubiquitous, even at high speeds down the freeway, that your car might be a very useful computing device, right? And you could talk to it, it'd tell you things and interact with it. And so, you know, who knows, when your shower might talk to you, you know, do something interesting. I don't know what, but there's going to be kind of a world of computing devices around you at any given moment, and they will have the ability to do things for you and give you an experience or enhance the experience that you're going through at any particular time. So, you know, if you've been to one of my talks before, you know I like to think kind of philosophically first, because I don't want you just to tell me about a technology. I want to put it into a context so I can understand what is this useful for. So, here is the question I'm asking this year. If we've been thinking primarily about building experiences that revolved around web pages on a PC, which is the vast majority of the web today, is designed for web pages on a PC. But I think what's going to happen in the future is the experiences are going to move more towards whatever device I happen to be near. And many of these devices will be vastly different capability-wise than whatever a PC might be. And so we're going to have to think about, well, how do we take the experiences that we're creating for people? And you see, in the past, what we said is, if we want to have a great experience, we thought about a great page. Because pages were it, man. And we go to a page, well, that's a cool page, and it has a great design and a great flow and all that. And what I'm saying is, we're going to have to think beyond just a page or a set of pages that are designed for a PC into something that's a multi-device experience. Well, so really what this comes down to is often data, right? I mean, and so we have to think very carefully about the data that we want to share, how we want to share it. As I was talking to some people earlier, you know, some thinking about data came up. It's like, well, you know, how should I think about what kind of data I want to share? Obviously, I'm going to have to be very controlled about the way in which I share it. I'm going to have to think about, you know, scalability and bandwidth issues and, you know, kind of the capabilities of the device I'm sending out to. So I have to think a lot about data. And this is where one of the first big divides of our thinking happens. Now, if you've been doing web services or SOA, you know, historically, we thought about, from that sort of SOAP-oriented world view, we thought about methods that operate on data. That was just the way you tend to think about things. So I would have like, okay, if I've got, you know, a conference service and I've got sessions, that's my data. I have a method called get sessions, and it returns me a list of sessions, okay? Well, that was sort of the method-oriented thinking about data. On the RESTful world says, who cares about methods? It's about resources. And so what we want to do is say, just the get is implied in the HTTP protocol, right? I'm doing an HTTP get, just HTTP get, and I have a resource called sessions. And so in that world, that's the way you think. You think your data is about shapes of resources that you choose to share out on the web with people. So then, what is that beep? Is that that thing? Okay. The clock is freaking out on us up here. All right. So the data has to still get somewhere somehow, right? And it doesn't just magically appear and show up out of your database. There are services that do this. And so obviously we have to choose to implement services in some way. So we're going to get the data where it belongs. Now, this is where the world gets interesting. Last year, I said this. As I was thinking about the SOAP and REST wars, one of the conclusions we came to, as I debated this with many people inside and outside of Microsoft, was that if we wanted to have a web of services, it should work the same way the web of pages works. Now, the SOAP services work the way the web of pages works? No, not really. You say, yeah, but Ron, it supports HTTP. Yeah, kinda. It sort of tunnels through HTTP, but it doesn't really work the way the Web of Pages works. Why would I say that your services should work the way the Web of Pages works? I say that because in this new world of lots of devices all over the place, guess what? Most of them don't have a SOAP stack. They just don't. They can't do SOAP. Even if they wanted to, they don't. But I guarantee you that 99.9% of them will have an HTTP stack. Why? Because you can't hardly produce a device that doesn't speak HTTP anymore. It's like, you know, it's like a baseline requirement. It's the lowest common denominator, which means that everybody's going to do it. Now, in the event that .NET takes over the world and everybody writes .NET everywhere all the time, this will not be a problem. I'm waiting for that day. Okay? It hasn't happened yet. Okay, look, it's probably not going to happen. There's always going to be a plurality of stacks and devices that we have to address, which means what this means to you when you design services is that you need to think and understand, how does the web want to work? You know, there's sort of a grain with the web, right? You know what I'm talking about? Like, if you ever do any woodworking, you know, they always say, like, sand with the grain and things like that, because wood has sort of a grain to it, right? And it has a way it sort of wants to go. And so any technology has a grain to it. It's sort of like it wants to work this way. I always get concerned when I talk to people, and they go, well, you know, I'm going to take this technology that you guys said does this, and I'm going to do that with it, because we think that would be really cool. And then what happens is conversations go on, like, and they ask the people who wrote it, they say, can this technology do that? And the guys go, maybe, I think, it might work, right? Or something like that. That's a bad answer. If that's the answer you get, just give up this plan. That means you're outside of the boundaries of the way the thing likes to work. So work with the technology the way it wants to work. That's all I'm saying. All right. Now, let's get down to some specifics with WCF. The nature of this talk is really to help you to understand this world. Does that look simple? Isn't that great? It's just simple. And you're going, no. This is the new face of WCF. We created this slide for the PDC. And you may have noticed that some technologies kind of got renamed about that time, last November. And the names were all changed to start with WCF. So like data services used to be called ADO.NET Data Services. Now they're called WCF Data Services. And RIA services were whatever they were, .NET RIA services or something like that. And they became now WCF RIA services, okay? So why did we do this? Well, first of all, we wanted to enforce the notion that WCF, as the name implies, is a foundation. So it's not just a one thing. Like most people, when you say WCF, they go, oh, well, that's for creating SOAP services. And we say, yeah, it does that, but it does more. So it consists of course, at the lowest level, kind of a very open channel model that allows you to plug in different things that you want, like, you know, formats. You can do Atom, you can do JSON, you can do XML. You can support lots of different kinds of transports like HTTP, TCP, MSMQ, name pipes, and so forth. It supports a lot of protocols like SOAP, HTTP, or OData protocol, right? And then there's kind of this service model layer, which is optional. You can use it if you want to. You don't have to. Some of the things that are in the top level don't use it, but it's essentially a way of describing your service in terms of contracts and behaviors. And then at the top level is the programming model. This is the area that when you touch the service, you're probably interacting with these things, these programming models. And so part of the goal today is to give you just some insight into the programming models and which one is appropriate for what, okay? Obviously, I don't have time to talk about 5 different programming models in this session, so I'm going to just touch on a couple of them. But very briefly, SOAP services, I think everybody knows what a SOAP service is, but I think positionally, where do SOAP services really shine? they shine in kind of a classic, if I can use that term for something so recent, classic SOA environment, right? Typically inside of an organization where you're exchanging a lot of messages and many kind of, sharing data across mainframes or other cross-platform things. The SOAP protocol is industrial strength, very powerful, and supports lots of rich message-level encryption and things like that. It's great for that kind of stuff. If you said, I want to create an app that's great for mobile phone users to, access my service, it's probably not a SOAP service. Probably not. So that's the first one. Let me flip all the way over to the other side, which is a workflow service. And so if you said, well, I want to have a service that can handle kind of coordinating lots of long-running things, like maybe somebody submits something and then it has to be approved by their manager, and so that might take a couple days before they get around to it. I need a service that will sort of store that and then wake up later when the manager sends the approval and then sends off emails and updates databases and things like that. Workflow services are fantastic for that kind of solution, and they're written with Windows Workflow in .NET 4. Okay, that is an entirely new workflow engine. If you ever looked at workflow in the past and you go like, "Wow, that workflow blows," just forget that. We blew it up when we started over. Okay, so we have an entirely new workflow engine in .NET 4. You want to look at it. It's very cool. I'm not going to show this today. Okay, that's one that I don't have time for. RIA services. That's darn cool. Now, I went to a whole session on RIA services earlier. I'm sure some of you were at that session. RIA services, you know what we found out when we first started creating distributed application technologies like WCF or even I used to work on the Com+ team many years ago, and we're like, N-tier apps are cool and everybody should build N-tier apps. And you know what we found is that most people are like, yeah, that looks cool, but I'm kind of busy. So, they create apps that just talk to the database, and they gave up on the N-tier apps, right? They just did because it was, it's kind of hard. You have to think more, and you have to design more. And so, when we got Silverlight out there, people said, Silverlight, way cool, but I can't just talk to my database anymore. Now you're finally forcing me to do this N-tier thing, and you're asking me to understand all this stuff about distributed app design, and how should I create services, and how should I deal with change sets on the client, and it's just a lot of stuff to understand. And so with RIA services, what we said is, okay, look, we're going to give you a ready-made approach. It's not the only way. It might not be the best way for you, but it's a way, okay? It is one way that you could do this, and it's a ready-made approach. It spans client and server. Just put it in place. And if you like it, you like it. Go for it. It's great. It is, so really, in terms of RESTful services, I position these in a stack, if you will. So RIA services is like the top of the stack. It's very, very prescriptive. It does what it does. It's super easy to get started. It's powerful. It's cool. And works in Silverlight apps. It's great. It tends to produce a model that's, just Ron's opinion here, that's kind of tightly coupled between the server and the client. But hey, for most people, that's totally fine. And if that's fine for you, great. I think RIA services is way cool. Then a level below RIA services, although RIA services is not built on OData, I think of it kind of as a level lower, is the data service. The data service is great, and it's interoperable. It does produce a kind of a cool client-side stack, which I'll show you just very briefly a little bit about this. But it's an amazing model. It's super easy. I'm going to spend some time on it. And then at the lowest level, you get web HTTP services. Now, I mean, so in any world that we work in, we have levels of abstraction we deal with, right? And it's usually best if the highest level works for you. It's usually best if you use the highest level thing because it's easier, you're more productive, you get stuff done faster. But you might say like, yeah, it's okay, but it's not exactly what I want. Then you can drop down a level, you can try the lower level thing. And in fact, the data services has a lot of lower level things and hooks at the lower level that help you to kind of modify its behavior. So they have things like, query interceptors and service interceptors and whatnot. So these are sort of examples of hooks that they try to do everything for you, but they give you some hooks that you can jump in and alter things. But it still works the way it works. And if you say to me, well, I don't like the way it does that, can I change the way it does that? And we'll say, no, you can't change that. Then drop to the lowest level, which is the web HTTP services. Okay? Does that help you to think about how these things position? Now, ideally, we would be in a world where there's no overlap between these things. They're like, this is for that, this is for that. We're not in that world. There's a significant amount of overlap in the way that the RESTful things operate. It's okay. It's okay. I think of it in terms of a stack of abstraction, ease of use, and power. Okay, and then we'll go on down. So I'm not going to show you RIA services. There was a really cool session on that earlier. It was way better than what I could show you. I'll show you a tiny bit about data services just to kind of set some context. I will show you one thing that nobody has showed today for data services. So I was like earlier, I was in the talk there, I'm going, oh my God, everybody showed everything about data services. What am I going to say? And then I realized there's one thing that I did that nobody has shown today. So this, you will see it here. Okay. All right, so let's talk about data services. Data services are model-driven REST, okay? And so really the idea is, remember I said that REST, the orientation thinking of RESTful people is, I'm not sharing operations, I'm sharing resources. The operations are implied. They're implied because in the world of REST, you're building on top of the protocol of HTTP, which has verbs, right? Get, put, post, delete, and so forth. There's a whole bunch of them, but those are the main ones, right? And so we say, look, we already have a protocol that implies operations on resources. Now, I might not allow you to do those operations, but why should I think in an operation-centric world? So this maps very nicely to saying, well, here's a model of my data, and I just want to share it with the world. So, typically the simplest path here is I start with a database, and then I go generate a model from my database. Don't have to do it this way, but 95% of all model-driven services actually live on top of a database. And then you get a model. And the cool thing about the model is because you're now in the world of declarative. Okay? Declarative says, I'm going to tell you what I want, not how to do it. I'm going to tell you what I want. And I'm going to let you, the platform, figure out how to do it for me. Declarative is great. I would always opt for declarative if I could, if it works for me. So now, what you end up with as a data service is a class, a data service of T. You got this one method that's called once, just kind of initialize things, gives you a chance to set some rules about access and protocol version and so forth. So that's simple. Let's flip over here to the laptop, which went to sleep because I didn't plug in the power. I love that. That's really cool. So, Mr. Laptop, please wake up. Yeah, except for that Mr. Laptop's not responding to Control-Alt-Delete, which is not a good sign. Okay, let's flip back over to the slides, and I will see if I can repair the laptop. See, all that time I was talking to you guys, I should have been plugging this in. All right, that's okay, because we're going to get this plugged in and functional. So, that's never a good feeling when Control-Alt-Delete doesn't do it. That's not good. But I see activity. Okay. Pardon me while I hold down the power key for 5 seconds. Okay. And, all right. Here's the thing about the data services. It is, in my view, maybe maybe other than RIA services, but I think even compared to RIA services, it is probably very, very fast and easy. Some people might say quick and dirty. I don't agree. It's really fast and easy. It's essentially, as I said, rest over a model. Now, somebody was asking me, well, I think of services like operations, like the SOAP way of thinking. Can I do that with OData? And the answer is, yes, you can. There's another question is, should you? Maybe not. I would encourage you to think hard about that, right? Because, remember I talked about the grain. There's a grain in REST. Creating an operation in a RESTful service goes against the grain. See, it'll work. Yeah, it'll work. But is it a good design principle? Probably not. So if you're thinking, I have to add operations to my RESTful service, you should probably rethink that a little bit and go learn a little bit more about the philosophy behind RESTful services, and your service will cooperate better with the web. Let me just say it that way. All right, so, I missed one big point there. You see the last point? Power to the caller. This is a big philosophical issue. This isn't the thing I was mentioning earlier, but it's one of the things that I thought as I looked at this landscape, and I say, if I look at a data service, it's kind of cool that it allows me to query over the model, isn't it? That's kind of cool, right? I mean, because, I got all these entities and stuff, and I can select what I want. I can query over the model, and I could query over whatever I choose to query over. That gives me, as the caller, a great deal of power, does it not? Right? Now, there's something in my history that reminded me of this. Many years ago, in the 90s, early 90s, I worked on a project where we built this app, and it had a query by example screen, QBE, and so sort of had you could create all these things and choose the fields you want and the operators, and you would create this kind of dynamically build queries, which was really cool. It was a case where we gave a lot of power to the caller. And you know what happened? Our database server would just suddenly go spastic, and the disk would thrash, and the query performance would go down the tubes, and and all the people would be like, I'm trying to update the database, and it's getting timeouts. And we started saying, what happened? Oh, our query by example, guess what happened? People started creating queries where there were no indexes that resulted in table scans over our database. And so we realized right away that giving the users, the caller, that much power over our database was not such a great idea in the end. Now, I'm not saying that will always happen here, but it made me think. In fact, what we ended up having to do with that system was we had to snapshot a copy of the database and create like a query-only database and say you could only query against that one and not the other one where it's getting live updates. So you could only get what was yesterday. But that was the solution we came up with. But it made me think, when you give the caller power, it's difficult to predict what the caller will do. Well, that's a philosophical issue, right? And so, in fact, if you look at the RESTful APIs that Twitter and Facebook and other people provide, you will see that they're pretty constrained. They don't give you much power. In fact, they give you very little power. You get what you get, and that is it. I mean, you can't ask for kind of random queries on stuff. And I thought it was very interesting that they chose to go that way. Now, not everybody's going to have that issue, and, if your site is accessed by 5 people, give them all the power they want. I mean, it's cool, that you can do what you want there. I'm just saying something to think about. And so I asked the data services team, I said, how do you manage this problem? Because really, I know some of us hardcore old-timers, and yes, I have gray in my beard. It is old. Okay. Some of us hardcore old-timers spend a lot of time tuning SQL queries in the day. And one of the things that made some of us a little nervous when we saw Entity Framework and Link and all these models is we said, what SQL does that produce? Right? Anybody? Am I the only one who thought that? Okay. And so I'm thinking, how am I going to know what indexes to create in the database? And you have to be careful about this kind of stuff. You remember the database is an engine, and every time you add indexes and things, you're asking it to work a little harder. So you have to be careful about how hard you ask it to work. And so whenever I saw this stuff, I love LINQ, I love Entity Framework, but it just makes me a little nervous to think about, I don't know what exactly kind of queries this is producing. Just a concern I have. Okay, so giving power to the caller always makes me a little nervous. There are ways to find out what SQL it's producing and things. You can find out, but I'm just saying it's something to think about. Okay, see, and so let me just log in here, and we'll see if we can get this guy going. Now, one of the things, if you went to the OData session, you just saw is that there are what Mike told me, he calls them easy buttons. Okay, there are easy buttons that you can do to constrain certain things about the caller. Like one thing you can do is call this set entity page size, and you can put limits on the page. You saw this in the demo he did just a little while ago. So you could, kind of constrain it down. At least you can prevent them from calling up 100,000 rows or something dumb like that, right? So you can do that sort of thing. But when it comes to, could you look at the expressions that they provided in their query and say, whew, that's going to give us a table scan? That would be really hard to do. It would be very, very extraordinarily difficult. One guy and we were on this big email thread with all these engineers, and one guy said, well, you could do this and this and this, and they came up with this, big, hairy, complicated solution. And I said, yeah, and if you did that, you know how to write your own data services. So anyway, it's very hard. All right. Now, here's the thing that nobody has showed, but because this is one of the things we built in .NET 4 at the lower level pipe, at the WCF level, you can now control the URI of your data service by using the routes, system web routing, right? So if you're an MVC guy, then you've done routes, okay? But if you're not an MVC guy, routes just allow me to assign a URI that I want to reference a resource with. So what I have here is a data service host factory. I create a factory, and then I call the route table. I say, here's a route. And so in this case, the URI will be relative to the website. And I just say, if you get a call for the conference URI, I want you to use this factory to create the type conference. Now, this totally works, but if you generate a data service from a template, you won't get this, okay? So you have to add it yourself, okay? So when my machine comes up here, I will get that. I'll show you how that's done. So, but it's very cool. And why would you do this? Because there are some people, we like to call them Rastafarians. And Rastafarians care a lot about URIs. And one thing they really hate is .svc. They really hate to see that in their URIs, and they want to get rid of it at all costs. And so previously in .NET 3.5, really the only way you could get rid of that was kind of at the IIS level with the URL rewriting, and I showed last year how you could do it. But in .NET 4, this is a really cool way to do it. It eliminates the SVC out of the URI, and you can name this URI, the route, whatever you want it to be. Right? So that's pretty helpful. Okay, so machine is coming back here. All right. All right, so I'm already to the next demo, and the machine's just now coming up. All right, let's get this going. Okay. While we're waiting, I'm going to take a question or two if you've got a question while I load this up. Anybody want to speak out a question? Or not? Come on, people, help me out here. Okay. All right. All right, fine.
Well, so I'll ask, okay, the URI thing, that's actually very cool. Now, where do I put my effective URL at? I mean, is this still in my app.conf, or where is this at now?
Yeah, good question. All right. So it's kind of funny, actually, how this all started. When was it? About a year ago. there was a team at Microsoft that runs one of our big web properties, and one of their web developers contacted me because they were wanting to add RESTful services to their website, and they had literally like 500 services they wanted to add. And so I was showing him how it works and everything. He goes, that's great, but those stupid SVC files, those are like one-line files. Are you telling me I got to deploy 500 one-line files to my web server so I can have these services? I said, yeah. and he said, well, that just sucks. I'm sorry, that just sucks. So I said, okay, well, we're going to have to fix that. And so this is the way in which we fixed it. Whoops, I didn't mean to undock that. So let me show you. All right, so what I've done here is I've got a website. It has a model, and it's based on the little conference thing, just like I showed you with the screenshot before. I have my conference service here, which I added using the data service template. And you can see the conference service there is just like what I had on the screenshot. And so this is all fine and good. In fact, I can browse to it with the SVC, and I will totally see it. But then the route, what I did is I added a global ASAX file to my website, which most websites do have this. Okay, and then in my global ASAX, let me fix the indent here. I have application start, and then I have this register routes thing, and that's where the code from the slide came from. Now, this string here, conference, is the URI that will be used, and it's relative to the root of the website. Okay, so I'm going to go to my site, whack conference, and I'm going to see this thing. Right? So that's where the URI comes from. So this string, so I don't have to put anything in config or anything like that. And now, you notice that the type I'm referencing is just conference. Where does that type come from? That comes from our data service, right? That is the data service. Okay, so there is an SVC file on the website. It turns out if I use this strategy, I don't need the SVC file. Okay, I could just delete it. Be careful though, because before you delete it, see the way it's indented under here. That means Visual Studio says, "Oh, that SVC file is like a code behind for this." So just disconnect it from that and then delete the SVC file, because if you delete it now, you're going to lose your your thing here. Now, just for people who aren't familiar with SVC files, let me just show you what's in it. It's just one line of markup, right? And it just says, it's creating a service host, and it calls a factory here, the data service host factory, and that's all it is. It's just one line of markup, okay? And so you don't need it. That's what I'm saying. If you use the system web routing, you don't need this markup files. You can get rid of it. And it turns out there's actually another way in the config. If I don't want to use routes, I can add in the config in the service host activations area. I'm not going to show you this, but I trust me, you can do it. You can find reference on MSDN how to do it. You can just give the same information that you see here in the markup in your config, and then you won't need the routes or the SVC file. So you can do it either way. All right, so let me just, oops, wrong mouse. Okay, I'm not going to save that. All right, let's fire it up, and let's just, actually, let's do it this way. Let's view this guy in the browser. Okay, yeah, so you've all seen this, right, in the many OData sessions, and you see that I have conference.svc up there, right? And I can navigate into, stuff and see what the sessions are. By the way, one little interesting tidbit that you might not know is that URIs in data services are case sensitive. The first time you see this, it flips you out, because most people think that URIs don't have to be case sensitive. But in fact, let me just show you. If I do a lowercase s, I get a 404, which you typically don't expect on websites. So it just kind of throws you the first time you see it, but just be aware of that. All right, so I'm accessing the service through the SVC file. Now let me just access it through the routes. So I'm going to put in here conference. There it goes. Totally works, right? So I can eliminate the SVC file. All right, so that's kind of cool. That's my one trick, man. Nobody else did that today. I did it. All right. Okay. I had to do something. All right. Now let me talk a little bit about the lower level API. And so we'll see how this works. All right. So at the lower level, I'm just checking the time here because yesterday I totally went long. At the lower level API, you start off by declaring your resources. It's the same kind of way. Remember, with a data service, we declared a model. The model defined our resources for us. And the model actually defined the namespace of our service. It was all automatically done for us. But in this world, in the web HTTP world, nothing is automatic. You have to do it all. So I'm going to show you. It's really hard. Watch this. See, here it is. I declare a class that just is whatever it is. It's plain old class. I don't have to mark this up with attributes if I don't want to. Okay, now, in this case, I chose not to. I can use the data contract and data member attributes if I want to. And one reason I might want to is that the names, right now, what surfaces in my resource will be the names of the properties and the name of the class will surface right in my service. And if I wanted to use a different name, or if I wanted to control the namespace, or various things like that, or I wanted to mark one of these fields like is required, then I would need to use the attributes data contract and data member. That's how I can control that. So this isn't hard. One of the interesting things about this is that when you create the model over the database, the structure of your service is the structure of the database. Now, if you're good with Entity Framework, you can make that be different. Okay, I'm just telling you the simplest low friction route is the structure of my database becomes the structure of the model, which becomes the structure of the data on the web. If that works for you, it's great. If it doesn't, there's ways to work around it, but I'm just pointing that out. And in this case, at the lower level, you just create the service, and this has no relation to your data. It might come out of 10 different tables, and it doesn't matter. Right? Now, the next step up is you have to think about the URIs of your service. Okay, and remember, in data services, it's implicit. It's defined by the model. But in this case, you have to think about it. So you would probably, a lot of people do something like this. They kind of map out a URI template. So we'll have like, okay, we have our session resource, and you can go session WAC ID, and then that gets you one session. And then you could drill down into like session WAC ID, WAC speaker, and get the speaker for that one session, and so forth, right? And then you could have different HTTP methods. Like if I wanted to add a new session, I'm going to use an HTTP post. I'll post to the session resource. It will add a new one, and so forth. So there's a lot of ways in which you can think about this. I'm just saying it's something you have to think about. And now the final one is then you go off and implement your service. All right, so first I'm going to just show you kind of quickly the last year version of the service. Okay, I'll show you this, and then I'm going to, let's see, there it is. And then I'm going to show you the changes we made in .NET 4 to give you a kind of a better experience, all right? So first of all, here I have a session.svc file. And in fact, let's view the markup here. I want to show you one of the things we did in the markup on this file. This is something you can do in Visual Studio 2008, .NET 3.5. You know, if you want to do it that way, you can totally do this. Close that. Now in WCF, if you've ever done WCF, you're like, man, that thing's got configuration like crazy. Okay, and it does. You can. It's like this very flexible engine. You just plug in 5,000 lines of config, you get exactly what you want. Okay, if you know what the config lines are. All right. Now it turns out that when we get into the world of RESTful services, there's just not that many options. There's just kind of one way to do it. So instead of all that config, I can just use a web service host factory here, and that's an object that will create my service and do the right thing for it RESTfully. Okay, so I don't have to plug in all that config. In fact, I need 0 config for this service. Okay, which is kind of cool. And so I've got my service there, and let's see. And so I've got a little code inside this service. Just show you a couple of things real quickly about it. I mark it with a service contract attribute. You'll have to do that for any WCF class that you want it to be a service, right? I've got some web gets on here, and one thing that you don't see is an operation contract. We eliminated the requirement for that in .NET 4 because we're like, if you got web get, we know it's an operation, so we're not going to make you put operation contract on there also in .NET 4. So then I'll go off and get my sessions out of a repository and so forth. Let's just take a look at this thing in the browser, just so you can kind of see what's going on. And the first time you do this, you're going to be like, well, that's not bad. You know, it's pretty cool. I got my little session data here. I got a bunch of sessions, and like I said, I can put in session whack ID, and there it is, right? So that's kind of cool, and that's the way you can do it. In kind of a simple way to do it. Now let's go back to the PowerPoint, and let's walk through the steps to get there. Okay, so step number 1 is I create a service. This is just a class, right? It's just a class. It's real simple. Now, if I'm thinking about RESTful service, remember I'm thinking about resources, but my class has methods. So I have to kind of do a little mental mapping, right? So I'm going to return a list of sessions. So I have get sessions, right? And I want to support paging. There's no automagical support for paging like the data services, so I have to add my parameters in there. So right now I've kind of stubbed out the class. There's no attributes on it. It's just a plain class right now. Okay, so the second thing I do is I'm going to actually implement my service. It's just my opinion here. I like to see services actually kind of delegate everything off to some other layer in the code. I don't like to see a lot of code in my services. It's just my philosophy. So, I have a repository. I go off and get things and return them right out of the repository. Then kind of step 3 is I have to attribute this for WCF. Now, I mentioned service contract. There's another attribute here. You see ASP.NET compatibility requirements. In this case, I'm saying it's required. So what is that about? Well, what it is that WCF can kind of work in 2 modes. One mode is it works alongside ASP.NET, in which case this is about how it plugs into ASP.NET at a very low level. When it's working alongside, it's a little bit faster. So if you say that ASP compatibility is not required, it'll go alongside of ASP.NET because it's a tiny bit faster. Okay, but in this case, because I'm doing a RESTful service and there's some other things I want to do with ASP.NET, and I'm using Web HTTP, and I'm going to make it required, which means it's going to plug in a different way at ASP.NET. Now, then I take my methods and I attribute them for WCF. Now, if I just put WebGet on this method, now that WebGet says, I want to use HTTP gets for this, okay? And now, since I didn't supply any information about what the URI should look like, what's going to happen is it will get created with sessions, and I'm using the routes in these URIs so you don't see the SVC. But then the name of the resource will be the name of the method, get session, and the parameters will be query strings. And Rastafarians hate this. They totally hate. I don't want to see get in your URI. That's a very bad. They would hate this. And if you don't care, fine. Go ahead and do it. It's fine with me, really. But if you want to be very RESTful, you probably wouldn't want this. Okay, so how do you control the URI? You put a URI template on there. And now I'm just saying, okay, so this is going to be whack ID. Okay, and now I'm not going to see the name of the method in there. What I'm going to see is, whack sessions, whack 1, 2, 3. And that's the URI. That's now much more RESTful, okay? So that's how I do that. So in the URI template, you just supply the name of the parameter and inside the curly braces. The parameter, the data type of the parameter, if you use it in this way, has to be a string. Okay, if you use it as a query string parameter, it can be an int or whatever, kind of primitive types. But if it's in the path, it has to be a string, which is a weird restriction. It's just the way it is. Anyway. So in this case, for the get sessions, if I want to support the paging, there's a philosophical issue here. You know, because I showed you with the ID that the ID was part of the path of the URI, but now I'm using query string parameters. Now, there's a kind of a general convention that a lot of REST people say is that, well, if I'm dealing with something like the ID of a resource, you should put that in the path. But if I'm dealing with something that's kind of extra, like paging instructions or whatever, then that's okay to do query string parameters. So, you know, I think that's a good idea, so I kind of follow that. So these paging things, query string parameters are always optional. So they don't have to supply them. Where if I want the ID of a resource, that's not optional. You have to supply it, right? So anyway, if you just supplied one of those query string parameters, what WCF will do is it will look at the URI that you sent in, and it will try to match it to the best match it can find. So if I had, you know, another method that had just one query string parameter, then I would get an ambiguous, it couldn't match it because it had two that would probably match, so I'd get an exception. So anyway, you just have to think about those kind of issues. So now I'd have a URI that used query string parameters to control the paging. All right, and then the routes, we covered that. This is a little bit different if I'm using the a web HTTP service. You see I'm using a different factory. It's the same factory I showed you earlier in the markup, the web service host factory. So I just used the appropriate factory. Otherwise, the routes look the same. All right, and of course now there's no need for an SVC file. Now this is one of the new things in .NET 4 that's kind of cool. In the config, there's a couple of options here that you see for features like automatic format selection and help enabled. So I got to show you these. These are way cool. So let me show you those, and you'll see what they do. All right, so let's switch back to the laptop here. Let's turn this guy off here. And scroll this over. All right. So what I have here is another class session service that I've set up with the routes. Okay. And I'm just going to show you a few things in here. Let me make sure where all right. Here in the web config, I'm going to comment this out first so I can show you what happens when it's not around. All right. Let's fire this thing up. Oh, I forgot to start Fiddler since I rebooted. Let me start that again. Okay. Fiddler, by the way, is a free, debugging tool. It's very cool. It's very helpful for this kind of thing. I'm using a little Fiddler trick if you don't know this trick. Fiddler cannot intercept calls to localhost. All right? And so they have this little trick where you put an IPv4.fiddler and then the resource, and then Fiddler can get it. Okay, just the way it is. All right, so I'm going to go to my session collection using the session service class. Okay, there's my sessions. All right. Now let's say I put in some kind of bogus URI that we don't know about. Right. We get a nice little endpoint not found. Oh, great. That's very helpful. All right. So we can do something about that. Let me show you what we can do. All right. So I'm going to come over here and uncomment this. Let's fire it up again. Let's go here. Let's put in something bad. Okay. Now we get a nice new thing. It says, please see the service help page. Ah, that's pretty cool. I wonder what that is. Well, okay, it tells me what kind of operations I have at this URI. And I have a couple of gets, one that gives me, some query string parameters. So let's go check that one out. So I get here and I see, well, okay, I got a sample response body, a sample JSON body, XML schema. This is darn cool. And it created that whole thing on the fly, just out of nothing. I didn't have to do anything to provide that. It just creates it by turning on that automatic help page. Right? So that's a very cool feature that you get kind of for free, right, with WCF4. All right, so now let me show you the other kind of cool thing. let's go to this session here. And so I just pulled up a session. If we go over here in Fiddler, let's clear that out and fetch this again. Oh, it's not seeing it because I got to do the IPv4.fiddler. Yeah, that's another trick you can do. Yeah, it's just a different form of the same trick. All right, so here's my XML version, right? I called this, I got XML. All right, but you say, well, JSON is way cooler than XML. The JavaScript guys say so. All right, it's cool. What if I want to supply JavaScript? All right, so let's just drag this over here into our request builder. And I'm going to say, change this accept header. So I say application whack JSON. Okay, and let's execute that now. And we see here in the text view, now I get JSON. Okay, so this was big, okay, because in .NET 3.5, there was no way to do this. No pretty way. There was really ugly, hacked up ways to do it, but there was no really nice way to do it. So we changed the guts of WCF so that it can do it very nicely and easily. And in fact, there are other ways that people like to indicate what format they want. This is what we call content negotiation, right? Some websites, say like you put a query string parameter like query format equals JSON. Or other people like to use extensions on the resource like, sessions swak1.json. And if you want to do those methods, you can do it. Just in your code, you have to detect whatever mechanism you use, and then you can dynamically choose the output format at that point. So you just write it in your code. If you want the automatic format support like I just showed you, then the accept header is the way that it's done. Okay, so so the features that we build into the lowest level of WCF to support these things kind of bubble up into the other levels, which is why data services can now support JSON the way they do, because this feature was kind of built into that, right? And that's why the routing service thing works with data services as well. And in fact, I just had a hunch that it would work, so I tried it and it did work. But that was anyway. All right, so. That's kind of some of the new things in .NET 4. One last thing I just wanted to mention. I don't know if you saw this on the MIX website, this Incarnate thing. Incarnate was a project that the MIX team did, and they wanted to create this service that would call other services to find your avatar, right? So I put in my ID here, and it finds, searches Xbox and YouTube and MySpace and Facebook and tries to find an avatar for you. And so they came to me and they said, we got to call like 5 or 6 different providers to find these things, and we want to make these calls async. Can you come over and write some code with us, kind of pair program, and teach us how to do these, coordinate these async calls with WCF? And I said, oh yeah, that sounds like fun. So I came over. And we sat down and we started writing this code. And I don't know if you've ever tried to write async WCF client-side code. Anybody try to do that with the async program model, right? It's not bad if you're just calling one service, right? If you're calling 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you have to coordinate, don't proceed until all 5 of them are done, and handle exceptions if any from any of these things and all this. And so when they had like 5 lines of code, it blew up into about 500 lines of pretty complicated code, right? I mean, I'm implementing my own async result class and all this kind of, it was amazing code. It was really cool. And they, at the end, they said, well, thanks a lot, thanks. And I went away, and then later, when I downloaded the source code for Incarnate, I saw they ripped it all out because they said it's too complicated. People can't understand, how do you do this, right? And truthfully, it was very complicated. It was correct, but complicated. And so very often, though, we find when we're doing RESTful services, not so much on the, well, I mean, this is a service, and it has to consume other things. Coordination of a lot of stuff going on, async stuff, is difficult. And so I just have to throw a plug in here because it occurred to me later. In Windows Workflow 4, I could have done this with this simple activity right here. What I have here is a parallel activity that's going to call Facebook, MySpace, Twitter, and Xbox Live. It will coordinate all the calls. It will wait till they're all done. It will allow me to handle errors from any of them and combine the things, and I can put this in a workflow. It was dead simple. I could drop that right in there instead of 500 lines of very complicated code. Now, I just wanted to mention that because, people think, oh, workflow, I wouldn't use that on my website. It's like, that's for special things. I'm just saying, workflow is very useful for this kind of stuff. So, and it's very fast. There's no reason why you wouldn't want to use it. In cases like this, it's super cool for handling this kind of stuff. So, anyway. All right. Now we're going to take some time for questions, and I've got some useful links up there if you want to check those out. So, if you have a question, please proceed to the microphone. Otherwise, I'll have to repeat it for the sake of the recording. Apparently, I've explained everything. Oh, no, okay.
I want to make this new cool Silverlight app, so I wanted to use a real service.
Yeah.
But I also want to expose my data to my clients where they can use backend services to pull data.
Sure.
So I create a RIA service, then I just build a data service on top of the RIA service?
No. No, a data service and a RIA service are two different things. There's no reason why you couldn't have both in the same app, right? Because they can both build on top of your model.
Share the same entity framework. So...
I think Brad,
yeah, so
Brad just posted a post on doing that exact same thing today. Brad Abrams on his blog today, I think, on doing both of them.
Yeah, so I would just actually create an OData service that I'm going to share with the public world and say, go use that one. And my RIA service I would think of as private for my Silverlight client. You could definitely do that. Yeah.
In your WCF service that you had there, I saw you saw that you had Team Task in there with the came from the .NET endpoint blog.
Yeah, yeah.
That works great in Cassini with the put, but as soon as you do that in IIS7, you get a 405 error. Do you know how to fix that in IIS7 to make put work where that is intercepted?
I don't. So I don't know the specific of that problem, so I couldn't say. I haven't tried to troubleshoot it. Sorry. Any other question? You might want to come to the mic or not. Okay. Well, everybody wants to go get some dinner or whatever. That's cool. All right. Thanks very much for coming.